So Richard Shirreff is co-founder and managing partner at Strategia Worldwide. After graduating from Oxford, he served in the British Army for 37 years, commanding soldiers on operations or in combat at every level from platoon to division and rising to the highest rank before retiring from the army as NATO's Deputy Supreme Commander. Europe, many of you will also know him from the interviews on this channel, and we are going to bring together, I think, a lot of themes that we've explored before, but now the picture of Russian strategy is starting to become clearer. And I think we have to thank Mr. Donald Trump for revealing some of the outlines of that. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel, the work we do, the work on the ground, especially in Kyiv recently, and of course the support for buying armoured, vehicles, 4x4 vehicles that then become lightly armoured and are used by Ukrainian forces. Do please check out the description in the video. It's incredibly important that we help Ukrainians to remain resilient at every time, but especially at the current time when they're under extraordinary pressure. Richard, welcome back.
Jonathan, thank you very much. And it's always good to discuss these things. Although I have to say, I mean, I'd like to say it's great to be back, but the fact that we're having to discuss them casts a bit of a pall over them.
It does. And I think we're reaching quite a terrifying inflection point. Not that everyone, I think, shares. I wouldn't even call it cynicism. I call it realism, perhaps our level of realism about what's going on. But we've just had the national security policy of the US released, and in relation to Europe, especially, it seems unlike any document that's ever been produced by a US administration, certainly in modern times. And it doesn't really mention China or Russia as threats at all. I think that is extraordinary. And Europe and its institutions, rather, of Europe that go beyond the nation state, rule of law institutions, seem to be the prime target for this document. Were you shocked, or do you feel that this pulls together much of the things that we've been hearing fragmentary in a fragmented fashion from Trump and his cohorts?
I don't think it should have been a surprise to anybody. I mean, and it's timely that it comes at the end of 2025, a year which has seen the ratchet increase on a regular basis in terms of America's effective démarche to Europe, which started, of course, with Hegseth at the defense ministerials in February, stating quite clearly, quite unequivocally, that America will not underpin European security. It moves on. Then you've got Vance and his assault on Europe's suppression of freedom of speech and cultural failings. And then a succession of Trump-inspired or Trump attempts at Trump brokered deals to effectively force the capitulation of Ukraine. The appalling scene in the White House with where they roasted Zelensky. And then this comes to an end, this all brings it together, the NSS document. But I would say, I'd caveat up by saying this is, and Laurie Friedman produced a piece the other day. These documents are produced on a regular basis. How closely they're adhered to is a different matter. But nevertheless, it still is one of a piece with the theme that has run right through 2025, which highlights the extent to which America is now absolutely out of the equation as far as European security. And then if you read today's Times suggesting that it's worse than that America is actively colluding to break up the European Union and to see right-wing populists running free in Europe, it makes it that much starker.
This certainly seems to be a statement of intent in that line, and it very much fits with Putin's statements, really from 2007 onwards in the Munich Security Conference, that any international body, any rule of law body that stands in the way of Russian expansion and influence is essentially an enemy of the Russian state. This now seems to me a pincer movement from the US and Russia to break up all resistance and barriers and, let's say, coherent political and military barriers to Russian expansion. This is how I interpret what's going on here. Is this too paranoid, or do you see a similar pattern?
No, I don't think that's paranoid. I think it's realistic. I mean, the reality is that, and it's been clear, again, there was nothing new in this NSS document. It was clear, it has been clear right almost from the day Trump appeared on the scene as president in January, and absolutely, as I say, since defense ministerials in February, it is clear that Trump is presenting on a plate to Putin two of his most cherished foreign policy objectives. Number one, he's decoupled America from European security. And number two, he has torpedoed NATO. And NATO hasn't, I don't think NATO member states have recognized this. They certainly didn't recognize this at the summit in June because they are still desperately clinging on to, onto America's coattails. It's in the hope that America will somehow continue to underwrite European security instead of recognizing that that American underwriting is finished. It might come back, never say never, but right now it's done, and we Europeans have got to step up to the mark.
And this is where it seems, and of course you have very direct experience of dealing with the sort of command structure, but also the bureaucracy and the decision-making processes, and the US role in that. The appointment of Mark Rutte as a sort of consummate politician, as someone who was able to bring people around the table, find compromise, etc. At this point, is his role actually, or is the purpose he's serving, leading to tremendous weakness and delusion? Because he's still there giving the impression that the Americans are on side, that there is a chance to bring them on side, that NATO is united and strong, etc., etc. Whereas it feels to me that we're looking at a tree that has gradually rotted from the inside out, and it looks sturdy, but essentially there's nothing at the core when it's actually put under duress, and that duress may be, as outlined in your book, that may be a kinetic challenge. It may be a large-scale hybrid assault on Europe. It may be state capture, regime change, cyber. It could be a combination of all these things. It seems that NATO is exuding the impression of strength, but really is not capable of bringing people together when it matters, when it would put under duress, which I'm guessing will be in the next couple of years, if not sooner.
It is weakness and delusion to cling on to American coattails in the hope that somehow they will do a 180-degree turn and say we are 100% committed to NATO. That I think we have to say. I think we've got to be, we've got to say it as it is. And the Americans are saying it very clearly for us. We've got to listen to the Americans and change, and NATO needs to change its frame of reference fundamentally to reflect that. But having said all that, I remain optimistic because NATO has institutional strength. Yes, of course, in many ways it is underpinned by by American strategic enablers and military capabilities. But the fact is, it's got a very well practiced command structure. It's got a command structure which works, which can plan, and which can direct operations and think strategically. It's got a military doctrine that underpins the military doctrine of every member state. So it is an institution that works, that has got 76 years or so of building and growing and strength. But what needed to be said loud and clear at the June summit, which wasn't said loud and clear, is that NATO needs to Europeanize itself. And if nothing else, this NSS document demonstrates that in spade loads. I think it demonstrates that this desperate appeasement of Trump by Mark Rutte, by European leaders across the board, inviting him for a second state visit to the UK and thinking that somehow the glitz and glamour of a Windsor Castle state dinner is going to change minds is laid bare as absolutely futile. So it is about recognizing that Europe stands on its own. Europe has got the capability and the strength to do so if it believes in itself. There are signs that it does. That we'll see where things go with European Union attempts to to unfreeze frozen Russian assets. And certainly there seems to be a wind behind that. You've only got to look at the defense investment market. I mean, investors are piling into defense investments, not only the big primes, but also into venture capitalists, into startups, and which recognize the ability of Europe to harness ingenuity and agility and technical capability to meet the needs of defense. So it's all beginning to happen, but it needs clear leadership and it needs clear statements from European leaders that Europe's going to step up to the mark and stand alone. And it needs a properly thought through gap analysis of what is it that America underpins the alliance with, and therefore what does Europe, together with Canada, of course, and other partners, what does Europe need to do to fill the gap?
And Japan, of course, Japan seems to be behind the scenes decoupling some of the risk from being dependent on the US, which is an interesting move. And as I say, we have South Korea as well as a potential strong ally. If you were to rewrite your book based on war with Russia, based on what we now know about its cognitive warfare efforts, its decentralization, outsourcing of sort of hybrid attacks, its use of political infiltration, dare I say it, into various populist parties and groupings. How would you rewrite that book, or how would you rerun your research that went into it?
Well, of course, it's 10 years ago since I wrote the book. I mean, I think I'd finished the final, done the final edit and sent it, it was with the publisher, absolutely 10 years ago to the month. Um, and of course, since then, the reality is, the reality of the Russian covert war, and it is a covert war. I think talk about hybrid rather sort of diffuses it somehow. It is a war, and it is a war which the Kremlin believes it has been waging with NATO since at least 2016. And there is a pattern to it. And there is, and so, what the reality of what we're seeing, and you only got to look back to 2025, what's happened in 2025. Most recently, of course, Lithuania, balloons over Lithuania, closing Lithuanian airspace. Earlier this summer, drones into Poland. That was an act of war. Overflights, well, there have been many overflights and incursions into NATO airspace. Who knows whether in the UK, the Marks and Spencer cyber attacks, the Jaguar Land Rover cyber attacks, which hit the British economy hard, almost, I mean, absolutely, certainly criminally enacted, but were they state-sponsored criminals? Question mark. If not, you can be absolutely sure that Russia, and indeed China, and to a certain extent Iran too, but Russia particularly, because that is the existential threat, will have seen the impact of that on the British economy, and we should be in no illusions that they will be planning, they will take a leaf out of that book and be planning more such attacks against corporate entities in 2026 and in the future. I mean, you ask how I'd rewrite it. I think I'm in a sense, I think I'd say now, I would talk through the grim reality of the scenario in which Russia is forced, or at least Ukraine is forced to accede to Russian demands by an American president who is colluding with Putin. In 2015, we were absolutely certain that America stood foursquare behind the alliance. That is now no longer the case. So a scenario in which Ukraine is forced to capitulate, a scenario in which Putin rebuilds, regenerates his armed forces, and bears down again on Ukraine to achieve the full extent of his aims, i.e., a neutralized rump state with a Russian backed leader in Kiev. So Ukraine turned into a client state along the lines of Belarus. The four provinces which the Russians have failed to capture militarily in the last 4 years, presented to them on a plate by Trump, effectively. A gangster president carving up the economic assets of Ukraine with with Putin like two hyenas picking over the carcass, and moving downstream, absolutely the likelihood of a Russian attack, or a Russian attack to test NATO in the Baltic states. So I think, that is absolutely likely as we look to the future now.
And, they don't have a direct access to Hungary, but one could imagine a scenario where Orban is about to be replaced, and that would be a pretty desperate loss. I mean, that potentially is another scenario where, they may want to help and assist an ally, and spin narratives around that. So there are all sorts of ways in which this could go. The concern I have here, which few people seem to be yet, I think, wising up to, is that it always seemed to me from the moment Trump came in the second presidency, the best case scenario would have been him just to stay out of the way and do nothing. I think expecting him to support Ukraine financially was cloud cuckoo land. But just him being out of the way was the best case scenario. Now, as you say, we have a malign intent, which is the default. And despite, state dinners, etc., it always snaps back to the default. The worst case scenario is actually America helping to rearm Russia, helping to reinvigorate and save its economy, which is collapsing, and create a deal that both enriches Trump, but also helps Putin to rebuild his war machine in a country that has become extremely militarized and has returned perhaps to its Soviet centrist roots, in some ways resembling the enemy that you trained to fight.
That is not that is absolutely realistic, Jonathan. Indeed, the notion of Russia and America, or America and Russia doing economic deals together, the one to enrich Trump and his clan and his coterie, the other to enrich and give strength to the Russian state, is absolutely there in the Vitkov the Vitkov proposals. So I think, that is absolutely it. And the one thing that has thus far stopped that happening, and this is to the credit of Europe, has been Europe saying no. We're going to underpin and underwrite Ukraine, and we'll see what happens, because we know as we speak now, Trump is trying to force through a deal by Christmas, which is 10 days away. So it's a pretty critical moment. But this is, I mean, Europe continues to talk. Yes, it takes action of a certain sort, and it's trying to unfreeze the frozen Russian assets. But until European leaders are clear-eyed and realistic about the threat that Europe faces, then I fear for the future. Now, as we speak, yesterday, Mark Rutte said Europe must prepare for war. And that is, finally, we've had it said. Finally, we've had it said. But where are other European leaders saying, yes, absolutely? And not only that, instead of 5% by 2035 in 10 years' time, we're going to ramp it up now. Well, we know the Poles, the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Finns, they are doing so. They're putting their money where their mouth is. But what about Starmer? What about Macron? Merz? Yes, the Germans are investing significantly. But looked at the local scene here in the UK. We had the budget the other day. What did we hear about defense? Absolutely zero. What did we hear about the existential threat from a voracious nuclear armed carnivore determined to rebuild another Russian empire having picked the bones of Ukraine clean before moving on to other Eastern European countries, which are our NATO allies, which would precipitate war? Nothing. We hear about taxation and more money being shoveled into the sort of the welfare pit, the bloated welfare budget, instead of without any sense of the real nature of what we face.
And it's challenging, isn't it? Because the defense secretary talks a good game. John Healey seems to understand the nature of the threat. I've heard him speak a few times, and of course, much of the speech is indirect, as all politicians are, but he seems to recognize the threat. The deputy defense secretary is an ex-serviceman who, at Chatham House, really did seem to get inside the threat and articulate it. But as you say, the action isn't there. But I suspect we're facing a far bigger challenge, and this is where we may end up as the sort of last topic. I spoke recently to someone who is, I would say, they should describe themselves as a Ukrainian Cassandra, someone who has foreseen where we're going to be long before we got here. She was talking about drones in 2014 when no one had a clue what she was talking about. Now she's talking about cognitive warfare and all of societal resilience, mobilizing your entire population and somehow inducting them into the topic of defense, feeling they have agency and involvement. And in Ukraine, that is manifesting in a very specific way. You now have children who are developing electronics clubs and drone clubs that are supported by the sports ministry and the defense ministry. They are racing drones, jamming drones, building this equipment, gamifying it, and it's there part of the school curriculum, part of the school culture, involving everyone in a concept of national defense. Do we not need now to develop a sense of urgency, but to develop a sense of, I would say, this resilience and inclusion, that everyone is involved in the defense of the realm and our values?
100% yes. 100% yes. Um, but it's got to come from the top. Um, you talk about Ukrainian resilience. I mean, closer to home, one of our NATO allies, Finland, is a very good example of a country where resilience is absolutely baked into the national psyche. It starts in Finland with the fact that every family, the sons of every family, are called up because of universal male conscription. So every family is invested in defense. At the top end, the Finns run regular national defense courses, 3.5 week course, which brings together business, utilities, the health service, education, the military, all the fabric, the leaders of the fabric of Finnish society, and puts them through a series of wargaming scenarios in order to build their resilience. And then you have this alumni network that goes out and continues, and they all know each other as a result of that. So the Finns have baked in resilience as well. We haven't begun in this country. We had it. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. There was a degree of resilience. There was home defense. There were major exercises where home defense was regularly practiced, as well as the reinforcement exercises for the British Army of the Rhine, for example. And we need to be dusting off these government war books, and looking at how we can mobilize the economy for war, how we do civil defense, and how we build resilience. But it starts with, again, I've said it earlier, it starts with the Prime Minister going on national TV, looking the nation in the face and saying, we face an existential threat. Mark Rutte, the Defense Secretary, was right. We need to prepare for war. We are not preparing for war in order to fight war. We are preparing for war in order to deter war. And the only way you deter war is if you are ready for war, the worst case. And this is going to require a change of mindset. It's going to require changing the way we teach and educate. It's going to change the way we look at our economy. And there are going to have to be sacrifices. You may not be able to give your child a new bicycle for Christmas in a year's time, because that bike factory may have been converted into a drone factory, because we need to build up our armed forces. And if it's not a case of warfare or welfare, which is this ridiculous catchphrase that the media bandy about, it's a case of welfare or losing the lot. In other words, it's a case of defending ourselves, defending the ability to operate as a society, defending our people, or losing the lot. It's a binary choice. So it is fundamental that we start building resilience. And more broadly speaking, every company needs to be thinking about its own resilience. The assumption that the same sort of supply chains that operated in a global context, uh, which have done us so well, are now no longer the case. What happens if you are subjected to a catastrophic cyber attack, as happened with Jaguar Land Rover earlier this year? It may or may not have been, it was almost certainly criminally inspired and criminally directed, but it's absolutely out of the Kremlin playbook. And if I was sitting in the Kremlin, I'd say, well, if I can take down a few major British companies with cyber attacks, the impact on the British economy will be catastrophic. And the British will not have the money they need to put in defense. So they'll be weaker, which suits my purpose. And so it is incumbent, I think, on every company to think through its crisis management policies, procedures, and then to practice them and to bring in people to help them hone themselves. And if nothing else, to develop the intellectual muscle memory to cope with the unexpected crisis when it happens. So this whole issue of resilience is a national thing, but it's got to be led from the top.
And this time we will not have American war bonds or support or material necessarily flowing our way. The very last point, and this is a very, very quick one, throughout our discussions, we have been discussing essentially the pieces being placed on the chessboard. It seems to me that after this national security policy and various other trends going on, the pieces are now in motion in what may in the future be regarded as, use a crude label, World War III. But of course, it's going to feel and look different than the previous two world wars. They were different from each other, but it seems to me the pieces are now in motion.
They are in motion, but going back to my earlier point, it doesn't mean that it's inevitably going to happen. It is up to us to be able to say, no, it's not going to happen because we're going to stop it happening through effective deterrence. And if we recognize, you talked about the Russian cognitive warfare, this this placing in the minds of its adversaries the notion that Russia can never be resisted, that Russia is all powerful, that has an economy that will continue to operate and generate the Russian war machine and limitless population, which will generate the boots on the ground, which Russia can fire off regardless of casualties. Uh, and if we take count, do not take counts of our failures, but get a grip ourselves and recognize that we've got to do what we've got to do, then we can stop it. But no, I think the worst case is that we come to the end of 2025 with Ukraine in danger. I mean, Ukraine resisting heroically, but it's been bled white. It's suffered massive casualties. The money is running out. America cannot be relied on. The Europeans are talking the talk, but until they recognize that without a strategy, a properly thought through strategy and a funded strategy to support Ukraine succeed, Russia, may well end up being subjected to a Trump brokered capitulation plan. Then the pieces will continue to operate, and that we will inevitably, I fear, there will be a sort of sequence of cause and effect that leads us to the worst case scenario of a war with Russia.
So, Richard, thank you so much for coming back on. I think we're very much in alignment on all of these points, and many of the Ukrainian experts I speak to also tend to be of the same mind. Thank you so much for everything you're doing in this space to enlighten people about the threat, and let's hope we grow a spine, as it were, and deter it before it happens, and don't fall into the trap of inevitability. For today, though, thank you.
Jonathan, thank you. And we can do it if we put our mind to it.
Many of you generously contributed to buying a truck, a 4x4 vehicle for the armed forces of Ukraine in our recent marathon fundraiser for Car for Ukraine. That vehicle was delivered thanks to your generosity, and refitted in Lviv with life-saving reinforcements, the doors, windows, and the engine area. That vehicle was destroyed a few weeks after it was delivered at the front in a drone attack. All three servicemen survived with only minor scratches and concussion. Your generosity in funding the vehicle was instrumental in saving the lives of all three Ukrainian soldiers. Now we are launching our Christmas Tree Trucks 2025 campaign. The goal is to raise €11,000. So please help us buy another vehicle for one of the most effective Ukrainian brigades on the fourth Christmas of Ukraine's epic fight for survival against an imperialistic and genocidal neighbouring state. Help us celebrate the heroism of the soldiers who have held the line against all the odds, who fight for their freedom and pay a terrible price, while also, incidentally, protecting the freedoms of Europe.